Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome back to the Visibility Project podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. This podcast series is an initiative of the Midland Area Community Foundation's Cultural Awareness Coalition. We hope it creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world. In this month's episode, we will meet with Liz Westerman and JodiAnn Stevenson to talk about dominant social norms related to health and body sizes, the myths of diet culture, and body positivity. Both guests open up about their personal history with eating disorders, their interactions with health professionals, and navigating society's expectations. Liz has a degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in chemical and biological engineering and currently works at Dow as an operations leader in Michigan operations. At work, she is very involved in employee resource groups and has a passion for mentoring and is an advocate for mental health. She and her husband have a 3-year-old daughter, a 10-month-old son, and 2 dogs. She enjoys yoga, cycling, reading, and spending time outdoors. JodiAnn Stevenson is a body liberation-oriented health coach and personal trainer, as well as a doctoral student of Transformative Studies, researching colonialism's and capitalism's effect on our cultural understanding of health, with particular emphasis on weight stigma in healthcare. She lives in northern Michigan with her husband and one of her 2 daughters, as well as their dog, Princess Leia, and their cat, Luke Skywalker. Well, welcome, Liz and JodiAnn. I'm so happy that you're both here with us today. Thank you for taking the time, and I'm really excited for this episode.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So to get us started, of course, I want to get to know both of you a little bit better. I'll start with you, JodiAnn, and then I'll go off to you, Liz, next. But JodiAnn, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe tell us what you're passionate about?
I'm a weight neutral, size inclusive, body liberation oriented, health at every size aligned, health coach and personal trainer. That's a long title, but I feel like all of those individual markers are necessary to say. I'm also a certified group fitness instructor, 200-hour level yoga instructor, and intuitive eating life facilitator. I spend most of my time right now as a doctoral student, though, in the California Institute of Integral Studies, Transformative Studies department. I'm researching the ways in which our culture's sort of dysfunctional definition of health as thinness evolved out of colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. I'll be engaging in some participatory action research around that with specific emphasis on how health professionals do patients and clients harm via weight stigma and how we can maybe mitigate some of that harm. So just one last quick thing about that is I came to this work actually after a 23-year career as an English teacher. So I started just sort of casually getting my school's degree in health fitness specialist just for fun on the side because I love to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. And then I started to get into this aspect of things. My personal journey evolved and I became more serious about it and eventually took the plunge into making it my full-time career. And as far as what I'm passionate about, I love writing. I have 2 children. They need me less and less. They're 13 and 18. But I still am very involved in their lives. I'm passionate about my marriage and every kind of physical activity. I used to try to name them all and it just sounded ridiculous. So I just love doing everything. And I'm super passionate about where I live. I live in northern Michigan, pretty close to Lake Michigan. And I just love the Lake Michigan beaches and the surrounding forest trails here very much.
Well, you and me both. So, well, thank you so much for being here, JodiAnn. I'm so excited to learn more about your background and your expertise, and definitely going to need that today. So next, though, I want to pass it off to Liz. Can you tell us more about yourself, and also what are you passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Liz Westerman, a little bit of a different background than JodiAnn. Excited to learn from you though. You have an awesome experience there. So I am a chemical engineer. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, got my chemical engineering degree. Started out right out of college, working as a chemical engineer for Dow, and currently an operations leader, work in the plant. Come into work every day and make good products safely. I'm also a mom, so I'm really passionate about that. I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 10-month-old son, so they need me a lot, especially the son who's teething right now, but it's a lot of fun. I'm also very passionate about yoga and exercising. I'm obsessed with my Peloton, and it's a really great outlet for me to get out some of that stress every day. And I'm here to share a little bit more about my story too, and my background, and why I'm here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liz. I'm excited to hear more about your story as well. But the first thing we do today, I think that one of the most important things is to kind of do some level setting. And I think this would help me and help our listeners too, if we started with some definitions and some terminology that'd be helpful for us to understand. So I guess when we approach this topic, are there some appropriate terms we should be using to discuss this topic? And then also, is there some language that we should be avoiding? I'd love to learn more about this from both of you.
The topic seems to be body shaming, weight stigma, weight shaming,
Right.
body
Correct.
size shaming. I think it's important to first understand that there are people in the fat activism community, right? There's a fat activism community, and that have actively sought to take back that term first. And I think it's really important to talk about that, because the general population that is not part of that fat activism community might know that and hear that and think then it's okay to just indiscriminately and even derogatorily continue to use that word against people in a sense. Do you understand what I mean? So
Absolutely.
I think the word fat is like a great place to start, actually, because a lot of us have taken it back as an empowering word even, but that doesn't mean that we throw that around indiscriminately or derogatorily towards people. And then related to that, I think it's important to know what health at every size is, because health at every size is often talked about incorrectly, as if it means that every person at every size is always healthy no matter what. And of course, that's not the point of it. Health at every size means that every person, regardless of the size of their body, deserves respectful and dignified access to healthcare and health behaviors and health spaces. And embedded in that is the fact that thinness is not the same as health, and that we cannot tell how healthy someone is by looking at them or not looking at them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of terminology actually
Sure.
that is great to talk about, but health at every size is really important. The word fat is really important to deal with. The concept of thin privilege is really important to deal with. Acknowledging that fat activism is a social justice movement. And, like other social justice movements, it's running counter to dominant culture and requires a lot of unlearning and relearning to be engaged in a meaningful way. And then I wanted to say one more thing about terms, is that generally in the fat activism community or in the body liberation community, the terms obese and obesity are, because they are pathologizing of body size, are not words that we use, because the so-called quote unquote war on obesity, fought so tenaciously by capitalism, has really been a war on people living in larger bodies, not a war to make people healthier, but in fact a war that has only led to less and less health for people in larger bodies. So in general, those terms are rejected by body liberation community, and they're seen as unhelpful, and they're seen as words that only really increase hatred and fear of people living in larger bodies. So that's what I have to say about terms.
Yeah, no, I'd love
that's
to jump in.
super helpful. And Liz, sorry.
Yeah, so you saw me shaking my head a lot because I resonate with a lot of that. I'd just like to add on, from my background, having an eating disorder and There's a lot of triggering words there as well, where people may use the term anorexic to describe the way someone looks versus an actual disorder. I've come across that a lot in my life. So just being very conscious on that, it's not a term we say, oh, that person's anorexic because they're skinny. No, it's an actual disorder that they have. So yeah, that's just kind of wanted to add in that piece too.
Along those lines, I just really wanted to add too that when I was diagnosed with my eating disorder eventually and finally, it was atypical anorexia, which is a more and more common diagnosis as health at every size has become, something that health professionals are aware of, which is to say that someone can be anorexic and not look anorexic. And that is really something that our culture needs that in general, people can become much more aware of. So using language that's offensive or triggering, anyway, you could be triggering people that you just look at and assume they have no problem, right?
That makes
I don't
a
know
lot
if
of
that
sense.
makes sense.
No, that makes a
Yeah,
lot of sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's actually not something I've ever thought of either. So thank you for that. That's really enlightening. So thank you so much for giving some, that level setting. I think is so important as we get started in this. But next, I really want to hear about both of your personal stories related to body image. So I guess this time JodiAnn, I started with you last time. So Liz, I'll start with you this time. Can you tell me about what's your personal story as it relates to body image? And maybe can you share one or two impactful moments that really, really stuck with you?
Yeah, no, I'm kind of excited to talk about this. And your questions have me reflecting a little bit because it's changed a lot through my life, I think, especially becoming a mom and getting pregnant. But I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, anorexia, in high school. It was, at the time, wasn't aware, had family members, escalated and brought me to the doctor, and I got the right help, luckily, very early. I was diagnosed pretty early in my life and was able to get the help I needed. But, dealing with the stress and anxiety in my life was really how my mind dealt with that was through an eating disorder. So kind of struggled with that throughout high school and college and even into like starting my career. And I started to notice, right, big life changes, triggering changes would kind of trigger that thought back and that disordered thoughts, disordered eating back there. And I was really nervous when I got pregnant that would happen again. But luckily, I had some really good doctors to help me through that and talk through that. And that didn't happen. I was able to stay healthy throughout my pregnancies and have two beautiful babies. But what was triggering is I didn't realize how much people commented on how you look throughout your pregnancy, much more than any other time, right? And so that piece I think was really hard for me, was to not allow that to make me want to slip back to kind of old ways or old habits. Yeah, so I think that was the big piece, was just, realizing how people will always make comments about how you look, no matter what, right? Whether they think you're healthy or not. And it really can be pretty triggering. A couple of, I guess, times in my life that stand out to me were, again, using the term anorexic, right? Someone I was young in my career, was starting out, another person I worked with kept using that term as kind of like something funny to describe themselves. And it really hurt me. And every time I kind of heard it, I would shut down and not want to work with them and not want to collaborate with them. And I had really reflected on this a lot and noticed it was affecting kind of my work in the workplace. So eventually I kind of got up the courage to, pull that person aside and tell them my story and say, hey, here's my background. I understand you're trying to be funny when you use this term, but it's pretty hurtful to me. And luckily they took it very well, and they said, I didn't even realize, I wasn't even aware that was a term that was hurtful to other people. And we ended up working really well together moving forward, and it was a non-issue. But I like to share that story because a lot of times people just don't even know that some of the words they're using are very impactful to other people.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I first wanted to ask about terminologies that are so we can better understand that. And I want to dig deeper as we go along in today and some of the things you brought up, Liz, because that's really like about, why do we think people comment then on why you look? And I definitely want to circle back to those because you brought some amazing points, Liz. So thank you so much. And JodiAnn, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your personal story as well. Your personal story as it relates to body image, and also for you, one or two impactful moments that really have stuck with you throughout your journey as well.
I became aware of my body as unacceptable at the age of 4. I remember it very specifically when a family member asked my mother why I was so fat. And right in that moment, and when I think about it, I'm like, oh, well, there must have been seeds already planted then, because I immediately knew fat was like the worst thing you could be in this person's mind, the way that they said it. So that happened. And from that moment on, I kind of thought of my body as unacceptable or a problem or wrong. And that was exacerbated by the fact that year too, I began experiencing sexual abuse. And so, I mean, if I had never heard that comment, or I had never gotten the message from the culture that there was something wrong with my body, even that experience alone would have been enough for me to be distrusting of my body, dislike my body. But the two combined were really like a big bomb going off in my head at that age. And so, I really suffered from extreme body hatred for a really, really long time. And I think it was around puberty when my grandfather told me that I was fat, like in front of a bunch of family members. And my dad started kind of calling me names. And you can hear, even when I tell this story, like there's nervous laughter in me telling that story, right? Like it's obviously not funny that this happened, but around that time, I think was the first time I started restricting food intake. And then what we don't talk about a lot, and one of the things we might get to later is why diets are damaging. And one of the reasons that diets are damaging and restriction is damaging for a lot of people, myself included, is that restriction leads to binge. Restriction leads to binge. Restriction leads to binge over and over. I just began this really terrible relationship with food and body and movement around that time, using exercise to punish myself at the same time as all those other things. And I would say, looking back, a couple of things that's really interesting. My mother was definitely had a disordered relationship towards food and her body as well. So I learned a lot from her. And I also am always shocked when I look back and I look at pictures of myself and think about the things that family members said and people said about my body, and it wouldn't matter one way or the other, but it's fascinating to me what I thought my body looked like when I look back and I see that my body was perfectly normal. It was within the range of what any sane person would say was normal for a child, but I really didn't think it was. So anyway, so that led to a long up and down relationship with food and dieting and disordered eating. And eventually I wasn't even diagnosed with an eating disorder until I was really heavy into triathlon. I was never competitive, but I was completing lots of triathlons and stuff like that, having a lot of fun with it. But I started to get competitive, and I was involved in a triathlon group, and everybody talked about weight loss all the time and how important it was to be small. And sort of like for the third time in my adult life, I weight cycled. And weight cycling is another term we can talk about, where you lose a large amount of weight and then you gain it all back with interest. Diet culture will call this yo-yo dieting because the onus is on the dieter in that case. But in body liberation and in health at every size community, we really talk about that as weight cycling, because it's really a physically unhealthy thing to do to your body, to lose a great deal of weight and then gain it all back with interest. And there are biological mechanisms that make that happen. It's no one's fault that happens. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you failed at something. The body is trying to save itself. So it has all kinds of mechanisms for making that happen. So anyway, the third time I weight cycled, I was diagnosed with atypical anorexia, and just this whole journey it just blew my mind. It all opened up to me and changed my life. And just one impact, I think I already talked about some impactful moments, but one more I want to talk about is the last time I lost a lot of weight, the last time that I really allowed myself, I related so much to Liz saying that I don't know if you said it was a control thing, but at really stressful moments in your life, it would become this thing that you could go to, this thing that would help. Yeah. And I really relate to that. And I was never so well loved by everyone around me as when I was my absolute sickest. People that didn't even talk to me before I lost weight came up to me and just out of the blue would say, "You're so beautiful." And men that I worked with that were friends, would just be like, I remember coming out of a meeting and a really good friend of mine said, "Dude, you are smoking hot," like in this professional setting.
That's completely appropriate, right?
Right. So, but just, and this is what I mean about thin privilege. When people try to tell me that thin privilege isn't real, I have experienced it. Like, I know it's real because my life was different when I was very thin. People assumed I was better at my job. I got more offers to work with people and collaborate with people. Family members came out of the woodwork to tell me how proud of me they were. I have 2 master's degrees. I'm like a professional. I've done lots of stuff to be proud of. But my weight, man, that was the thing. That was finally it. That made them proud. So, and no shade to them, honestly, because that's the way our culture is set up.
Sure.
We're told that you should congratulate people when they do things like that. When they lose weight. So it's not their fault.
But I think it's really helpful for you to share that with us and to our listeners, that your personal stories and how it's with all good intentions of your friends and family. And we all know, I'm sure that I'm also guilty of this, but it's what society is ingrained in us. And so thank you for being here to share your stories and to enlighten us on how these issues have impacted you personally throughout your lives from a young age, from 4 years old. And I'm sorry you've had to go through these, but these are great examples of really what body shaming is. So I feel like for both of you, given some great examples. So one of my next questions was, what are some examples of body shaming? But I think that you really answered that one already. But can you dive a little bit deeper, both of you, into this topic of body shaming? And if you have any other examples of what body shaming is or could be, whether it's things you've experienced personally or that people are going through, and how that affects people. There's clear ramifications from this, lifelong ramifications. So could you maybe talk about some examples in addition to the ones you've already shared and how that affects us, especially those who are receiving those comments, affects them?
It can have a big impact, right? Small words can have a big impact, and people they don't realize that. And it could not even be intent of body shaming, kind of like JodiAnn was saying, right? It's any sort of comments on your body or the way you look, and whether that's positive or negative, right? That triggers your mind to think one way or the other and can be very hurtful. But trying to think of other specific examples. Maybe I'll let JodiAnn go and
Sure. We can tag team this.
Yeah. I'm thinking of one that I can share that I think is pretty obvious. But when I was in college, so I started having these episodes. I started having these panic attack episodes in my first year in college. That's not a stressful time at all, right? I was away from home for the first time, and so I was having panic attacks, and they were really severe, and they were getting more and more severe. And they turned out to be because I was on this birth control pill that was really messing with my hormones. But before I found that out, I went to my doctor for my annual physical, and I said, I'm having these really bad panic attacks, and they seem to be worse when, right after I eat, they seem to really be bad, when I eat. And she said, so this is a really good example. She said, well, it doesn't seem to have stopped you from eating. You've gained 10 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
Ugh.
So it's just, I mean, that's just like one of those things, like I look back on that and it just floors me that a professional person who is supposed to care about your overall health would say something like that, particularly to a woman of that age who is so at risk of eating disorder, and had she been paying attention to other things, she would have seen other signs. And then just one other thing I did want to say that I remember, it's not so much shaming, but it's a really good example of what Liz was just saying, like how there's not even an intent to body shame here, right? But when I was at my sickest and really, I was working out, I hope it's okay that I share these details, but
No, please.
I was working out 3 to 4 hours a day, and I was essentially starving myself based on how much activity I was getting. And I was as small of an adult as I had ever been. And I remember going to my final doctor's appointment with the doctor that I was seeing, again, who did not mean to sort of see me into an eating disorder, I'm sure. But when we were sitting down and we were going over my chart, right, the first thing she does is shake her head and say, your BMI is still too high.
It's like, what can you do, right?
I mean, my whole life revolved around the size of my body. I would wake up thinking about food. I would go to bed thinking about food. I would never talk about anything else. And I missed years of my children's lives, in a sense, because of this. But it was never enough.
It's a heavy burden to hold, to feel that, and to that stigma that society has put on to this is something that, I'm happy that you're here on the Visibility Project podcast, because giving some visibility that people have that emotional response and that sense of responsibility that society's put onto them. So thank you for sharing so much. Another question is body shaming. So for both of you.
I have one other.
Absolutely, Liz.
One other just example that popped into my mind. You sparked so many great memories. But another one just is body shaming around weight as a number too, right? And not just necessarily comments on the way you look one way or the other, but commenting on someone's, weight. I know I remember high school, throughout college, all the girls were like, how much do you weigh? All this. And that is also very, very triggering, has been triggering for me for a long time. But I do have one kind of, going back to my doctor, one positive experience that I did have, a great doctor. I, again, was going in for my anxiety, and she, you get weighed, my weight didn't change, all of that, but my heart rate was very low. My resting heart rate was just pretty low. It's a sign that you're not getting enough nutrition, and you could be restricting. So she talked to me. She said, you're in here for anxiety. Have you been having trouble with restricting or getting enough food? And I said, no, my weight's the same. And she said, well, that's not that's not the only indication. So I didn't realize that until she kind of said that I was like, yes, okay, I am slipping back into this. And yes, I do need more help. This was right when I had started my full-time job, right? Big life change, starting a full-time job off on my own. And she was luckily able to realize that and kind of catch that before it escalated further. So I just kind of really wanted to share that positive piece too. And that was kind of a eye-opening moment for me to realize that, yep, it's not just about how you look or your weight, right? It's a lot more.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I wonder if I can just piggyback on that and say something
Absolutely,
about doctors, because I just think, I have a handful of really bad stories about doctors, and not nearly as bad as some of that I've heard. But I think it's just really important for us to understand, to realize that doctors are just living in this culture the same way that we are. And if they haven't gone through a certain experience or had to face a certain cultural dominant paradigm, then they don't know any better than we do about how to approach that paradigm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
yeah. And so
I'm
they're
sure
learning, you know.
even doctors, they're being influenced by social media and television and movies, and
Mhm,
that really can help shape their views on these as well.
mhm.
So I guess my next question is like, how does social media, television, movies, how does that all impact our view of body image and society's view, both positively or negatively? Probably more negatively, I'm assuming.
I just think that social media and TV and film and you know, all of that is, it's like the manifestation of our cultural norms, our dominant cultural norms, you know. So I mean, I don't think that any of this comes from that,
Mm,
but I think that they are good tools for where it comes from.
that makes sense. That makes
Uh,
sense.
so, and it definitely is hurting people every day to see those dominant norms recreated, you know.
I was just going to add, they can be very triggering, right, to a lot of folks. And some people aren't as aware of that, right, for themselves. So me personally, right, social media can be triggering to kind of go back to those thoughts that aren't the best. So
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. And I think that you're absolutely right that it reinforces social norms that are already there, and just reinforces and, enhances them in ways. So I'd like to shift gears just slightly and to go back to something, JodiAnn, you talked a little bit about before, which is that diet culture. So, and I know that you really seem to be focused on debunking and breaking down that diet culture. So could you tell our listeners more about that? Like, what is diet culture, and elaborate a little bit more on why diets are dangerous?
Yeah, so diet culture is the set of values and systems. It's a whole set of them that equates thinness and physical appearance, first of all, with health, but then generally accepts that thinness and physical appearance is actually more important than health and well-being. So within diet culture, body dissatisfaction, chronic dieting, eating disorder, shame around body and food and movement are all normalized and treated as a simple reality of being human. And, you know, so diet culture is the reason why when we get together at a family holiday, a lot of the women will be in the corner, and usually it's women, but you'll see men engage in this behavior as well. Immediately, the conversation will turn to, what have you been doing? You know, what is your latest diet? Oh, I can't eat that. I couldn't possibly eat that. I brought these special foods because this is what I'm eating. You know, like, that is a really good example of diet culture. And then of course you'll see it, you know, as we were just talking about, in the media all the time. Actual diets being marketed, diets that say they aren't diets. You know, Noom is a really good example because they over and over will say, we encourage you to do intuitive eating. We encourage you not to diet. And that's just a complete lie. It is a diet. So, you know, diet culture, like white supremacy, like patriarchy, like homophobia or transphobia, all of these are simply the water that we swim in. It's just another part of the overall dominant cultural paradigm or hegemony that we all live in and participate in, either willingly or unwillingly, or knowingly or unknowingly. And like all of those other parts of the hegemony, it takes like consistent, ongoing, constant time and work, most of which is deeply internal, to dismantle or to help our communities dismantle. But you asked not only diet culture, but what was the second part of that question?
About like why diets can be dangerous.
Why are diets dangerous? So first of all, I already said that restriction leads to binging, right?
Right.
Diets break our trust in our own bodies, our trust in our own body's signals, and they break the physical mechanisms our body has to take care of itself. Dieting actually breaks a lot of the regulation mechanisms that our body has to regulate itself. So they're dangerous in that way. Consistently dieting, chronically dieting can lead to eating disorder. It can be really disruptive to our lives. And, you know, I just think like diet culture overall can lead to, well, it leads to body shaming, and body shaming leads to depression and anxiety and eating disorder and even suicide. And I mean, it can cause really, really terrible things. And when adults engage in this behavior so openly and so unabashedly, right, it encourages children to engage in that behavior. One of the most common forms, if not the most common form of childhood bullying, is weight stigma, is weight shaming. And that leads children to anxiety, depression, general body dissatisfaction, body hatred, self-hatred, eating disorder, suicide. There's absolutely nothing healthy about body shaming or diet culture.
Thank you so much for that. Can I now I'd like to hear more about, okay, so we know that diet culture and body shaming are negatively impact so many in our population. So what's a way that we can be positive? Like, what is a healthy way to think and act and be better when it comes to, yeah, like I saw JodiAnn, I know our listeners can't see it. JodiAnn is fist pumping over here. She's excited about this one. I'll start with you, Liz, on this one, but can you talk to us a little bit about, like, how can we be body positive? What's a healthy way then to think and act and be better about how the way we think about our weight and our bodies? And then I'll start with Liz and then go to JodiAnn.
I want to hear what she has to say.
Okay, we'll switch it up. Go to JodiAnn.
Sorry.
I think the number one thing we can do is accept that no one else's body is any of our business. It's none of our business. And we need to stop commenting on other people's bodies because they are none of our business.
Sure.
And if we're a health professional whose job it is to comment on someone else's body, then we have to undo these wrong-headed ways of doing things that are based in diet culture. We have to confront and dismantle diet culture and thin privilege and fat phobia, and learn a more respectful way of treating people with care and dignity and respect. Mind your own business when it comes to comes to other people's bodies.
I mean, that's as simple as what I wanted to say too, was just don't comment on people's bodies. And it's so hard because I know I've done it. I absolutely have. And again, not with any ill intent whatsoever, but yes, just don't make any comments about another person's body or what they look like. And for me, I've really had to, because people are going to do that, they will, and they'll do it without even knowing. So to help me so it's not so triggering, I just have to remember, like, they don't mean it with any intent whatsoever. They're just kind of commenting to comment. That's what I tell myself. And then if it does become kind of a systemic, I won't say issue, but thing that happens with a certain individual, I have learned to kind of tell them about my story and why it is so hurtful. So
thank you. And on that note, what should we then do? Is if you are or even if you were a bystander, what can somebody say if they hear somebody else body shaming or using offensive language or using just inappropriate language, either knowingly or unknowingly? What can people say and how can they approach that? What are your thoughts?
Did you know that happy, healthy bodies come in all shapes and sizes? Isn't it great that happy, healthy bodies come in all shapes and sizes?
Just starting with that. And
I think so. I think that's a really simple place to start. I think another thing is raising our awareness around the fact that when we're commenting on other people's bodies, we are commenting on our own relationship with our own bodies. And it has nothing to do with that other person. It's either coming from a place of insecurity or obsession with your own body. And so if people can't stop, and I will second Liz that I have been, particularly before this part of my journey, I was definitely guilty of commenting on people's weight. It's just what we do in this culture. But if you find it very hard to stop commenting on other people's bodies, that is a really good indication that you have some work to do on your own relationship with your own body, I think.
Yeah.
And I wanted this to come up at some point, so I think this might be a good place for it to come up. One of the things that women in their relationships with other women can do right now and forevermore is get it into their heads that it is rude and cruel to talk about how quote unquote fat you are in front of someone who is larger than you. It is such a common, absurd thing that thin women get away with doing to larger women. And I don't know why they've been allowed to get away with it for so long, but it's actually mean and cruel behavior. And we shouldn't accept that anymore. And if we're a woman who's friends with a woman who's constantly doing that, we need to tell them that they need to stop.
I would also, I completely agree with everything you've said and more. I would add, if you're on the receiving end of that, I'll say criticism, right? Be open to that and don't be offended. Take it as it is and think about kind of why that person is giving you that criticism, and don't, defend yourself or anything. Just say, yes, okay, I realize how that's hurtful and I can do better in the future.
Yeah.
It's not worth a debate.
Yeah. Just one thing that didn't come up yet, but I don't think we quite got to it, is that along the lines of why this is a social justice issue is that within the fat community, we talk about different sort of sizes of fat. Okay. So there's like small fat, medium fat, large fat. And that would I know that blows listeners' minds who don't have any understanding of the fat community or feet in the fat community. But the reason that that's talked about is that the larger body that you live in, the more you experience actual marginalization and oppression. So I have experienced body shame. I have experienced, weight stigma. But as a person who's still a small fat person, who's really like plus size or another word for me is straight sized, because I can still buy clothes in regular stores, right? I don't experience marginalization and oppression because of the size of my body. I can go on a plane easily. I can always find a seat that's comfortable to sit in a public setting. I don't experience things that people in larger bodies experience. So it's really important to understand that this is not about like sensitive people, making people feel better because certain people are sensitive about their bigger body, quote unquote. This is a social justice issue that affects people who are really, truly suffering from weight stigma in our culture.
Well, thank you so much. Just as we're starting to close out the hour here. So one example here is if you're in a relationship then with somebody who's either experiencing eating disorders or is the victim of body shaming and has this is weighing on them, how can people be in a relationship in these situations be supportive of their partners? What would you suggest in these situations?
Yeah, I would say listen, actively listen to where they're coming from and seek to understand, and don't just dismiss them because what they're saying doesn't make sense to you. And then offer help, have those conversations and offer help and say you're there for them, and, offer them resources that you can find. And I would say educate them as well.
For sure.
Yep. Yeah. I think a partner needs to be really open to educating themselves and having that open-mindedness that Liz talked about, just no assumptions made, and really for me, it was very helpful to be with a partner who had just an immense compassion for me, and also just was really careful about when food would come up, when, and noticed if I was sliding back, because like, as Liz mentioned, it's such a great, important thing to note when people have eating disorders, stressful situations, stressful times in our lives are triggers for those eating disorders. So to be a partner that's aware that that's a behavior that someone might slip into, not with judgment and not with control, but with compassion, just like Liz's doctor, who kind of said, well, it's kind of a marker that, this might be happening. It's helpful to have a partner who's aware in that case and can kind of help you check yourself.
Absolutely. And my next question here is, I can't ask you this one because I don't have any kids myself, but I know our producer has 3 young daughters. So what advice would you give to parents to help raise girls and boys, to help them in our culture that puts a lot of pressure on them to look a certain way? You, JodiAnn, you talk about your experiences as a 4-year-old. So what advice would you give the parents then?
I have 2 daughters, 13 and 18, and I'm so grateful that I discovered all of this before it was too late. And I would just say that body diversity, look into it, figure it out, accept it as a reality of life. Everybody's body looks different, is meant to look different, responds to food differently, it responds to movement differently, and just really respect that everybody's body's meant to look differently. Your kids aren't all going to look the same, and they're not all going to look the same as their friends. And there's a lot of resources out there for helping your child stay an intuitive eater, because babies are born intuitive eaters. There's a lot of resources out there to help your child stay an intuitive eater. I would probably suggest those to people who have small children and want to help their children navigate the really difficult waters of diet culture, because sooner or later, no matter what, even if in your own home, you can protect your child from body commentary and body shaming, the big world is going to have a little bit more influence on them than you do. So it's really helpful to set them up with a strong foundation of body trust.
I really like the intuitive eating piece because I do have young ones, right? A baby and a preschooler. And one of the things I'm worried about is just her learning that foods are bad or good, right? And that really connects all back to the diet culture of people labeling, sweet bad or vegetables good. So I've really tried to learn myself, educate myself on what intuitive eating is and what it should look like for my baby and my preschooler. So yeah, I'll second that. I mean, be very careful about the words you use around food and body image, because they're very, very impressible at a young age and will pick up on any little thing and any way you word things.
And movement too.
Yeah.
The way that we talk about movement or use movement with and to and in front of children, if we're using movement, if we're using exercise, I don't use the word exercise very often unless I'm talking about punishing exercise, but if we're using exercise as a way to earn food or burn food, that's not great modeling. It's a really good example of how you can kill, again, something that's usually very natural for most children, joyful movement. You can really kill joyful movement for children in that way, making it about that. Let's not even get started on the whole overhaul that our physical education system needs, because that also kills joyful movement for a lot of students, a lot of young children. So
excellent. So as we wrap up today, what would you like to leave our listeners with? What would be your final message to our listeners after today? And we've had a great conversation, a lot of great examples, and I've learned so much myself, but what would be your final message to our listeners?
My final message would be that diet culture, nobody's winning. Even if you think you are, even if you think you won the lottery in diet culture or you've got it figured out, the fact that everybody's body is being policed means all the time, means that even if you think you're winning, you're losing just like everybody else. So it's time to start dismantling and figuring out how you're contributing to this problem.
I guess I would go back to if you you feel like you're struggling with anxiety, stress, depression, and that's manifesting in disordered eating or controlled eating in any way, you're not alone. There's resources out there. There's people to talk to. If that's why I try to be so open about the struggles I deal with, because once I talk about them, people are much more apt to talk about them as well, and a lot more common than we all think. So you're not alone. There's many more of us out there, and there's a lot of good resources.
Thanks so much, Liz. And thank you, JodiAnn. Thank you both for being here today. I personally learned so much today, and I'm sure our listeners did too. So thank you for being here to share your personal stories, your expertise, and just thank you for your message. So
Thanks for having me.
See y'all.
And nice to meet you. Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you so much.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.